1754, the 7 Years' War started, also known as the French and Indian War, and it's also known as the only 7-year war to last 9 years. Sketch. Anyways, in that war, it was a fight between Britain and France and Europe, and we are the closest allies to Britain, and France was trying to move to the New World to get the jointment of the Native Americans. In this war, the Native Americans joined the France, but France then lost. Just time after the 7 Years' War ended, the Proclamation of 1763 was brought about. It was passed by George III, and it was to keep all the colonies in control and make sure everything was going good. Just after that, in 1764, the first law passed by Parliament was passed, and it was the Sugar Act. Just after the next year, then the Quarter Act was passed, so you had to support all British troops and giving them quarters and anything they needed. Now we are in 1765, where we have the Stamp Act is brought about. The Stamp Act certifies taxes and makes sure that everyone's paying. Then the Stamp Act Congress is brought about, and they are the ones that are trying to get the Stamp Act revoked by sending letters of complaint to Parliament and the King. The year after, they made the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act is which would revoke the Stamp Act, and it would lessen the Sugar Act, so that more people would be able to import sugar and it'd take less time to bring in more trade. Years later, the Townshend Act was passed. It was for taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. This led to a big dispute with all the colonies because they were very upset with taxes being enforced on everything now. Then this led to John Dickerson trying to finesse everyone else in the colonies by trying to get them to think they can override everything Parliament was saying and everything they do just because these letters he wrote trying to convince from a farmer's standpoint. But after this led to the repeal of the Townshend Acts, so they were upheld once at last. Now that years have passed, it is now 1700 where the Boston Massacre now takes place. The Boston Massacre is when Boston soldiers opened fire on a crowd of townspeople, killing 5 and really making mad every single local that was there because they don't like the British in general. So now that this has happened, this was the pivotal event that really led to the American Revolution, and it was the one event that really ticked off all locals and Parliament. Just 3 years after the Boston Massacre happened, the Boston Tea Party was brought about. The Boston Tea Party was a protest on December 16th, 1773 against Britain because Britain was doing taxation without representation. This led to the Americans pouring out 342 chests of tea that Britain had brought into the harbor. After this, the Karachev Acts were passed, and this was passed by Britain so that they can enforce punishment on any one American who was involved in the Boston Tea. Now in 1774, we have the first Continental Congress, which was the Congress meeting with all 13 colonies besides Georgia for colonial resistance, and this was against Britain. Lord Dumnor's War was taking place 2 months later, and it was a confrontation between Virginia and the American Indians. After this, it was now April 18, 1775, where the Battle of Lexington and Concord took place. It was the first military engagements in the American Revolution. This then led to the Second Continental Congress, where all 13 colonies were present, and it led to them making justice and raising more money so they can create an army and a navy to fight against Britain.
In July of 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill was during the Siege of Boston in the early stages of the Revolutionary War. Then in July 1775, the Olive Branch Petition was created for the final attempt to avoid war between Great Britain and the 13 colonies. A year later, a British citizen wrote a document named Common Sense to encourage the colonies to seek their independence. It did not take very long for this to happen. On July 4th of 1776, the 13 colonies adopted their independence from Britain. In December of the same year, the Battle of Trenton took place. Washington led the Continental Army against Hessian emissaries at Trenton. Almost 2/3 of the Hessian force was captured with minimal loss to the Americans. In October of 1777, there was a turning point to the American Revolution, called the Battle of Saratoga, which convinced French to give U.S. military support. It lifted American spirits on and helped defeat British supplies. Now, in 1785, the Annapolis Convention came about, which 12 delegates from 5 states, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia, gathered to discuss about reversing the protectionist trade barriers that each state had came up with. Now, in 1786 and 87, there was an uprising in Massachusetts. American Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays led 4,000 rebels in a protest against perceived economic and civil rights injustices. Following this went the United States Constitution. It was created and is the United States comprising of the 7 articles. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, there was an argument that large and small states reached that would part define the legislative structure and representation that each state would have under the United States Constitution, called the Great Compromise. Not far from this event was the 3/5 Compromise of 1787 that would determine whether or not slaves would be counted in determining a state's total population. It was decided that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. Following this was the Commercial Compromise. It allowed Congress to regulate interstate and foreign commercial imports, but it did not allow placing taxes on exports. The Federalist Papers were first published in 1787 and 88, arguing in favor for the ratification of the United States Constitution. This brings us to the winter at Valley Forge. This was the winter of 1777. George Washington's army was forced to stay in a very cold valley where hundreds died and thousands were deserted. After many small battles, these two armies met at Yorktown, where George Washington trapped 8,000 British soldiers on a small peninsula outside of Yorktown. This was a huge victory for the American army. This is what essentially won the war. Shortly after the victory, America was feeling proud of themselves and wrote the Articles of Confederation, which was basically an early draft of the Constitution. This established rights for people and decided how America was going to be ran. This was a very big deal for America. Even though America is very happy with themselves, the war still wasn't over. But over in Britain, politics bring the British Army back home. This is all pointing to a resolution to the war, which ends up being the Treaty of Paris, which was signed by representatives from Britain, America, in Paris.
Although the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolutionary War, it did not give any protection to the Native Americans. However, due to Britain being extremely petty, they decided to give Native Americans guns, and they tried to solve this by Jay's Treaty in 1794. However, it did not help, and Democratic Republicans were very angry. Conflicts that were happening with not just Britain, but also with Spain, and the treaties that were trying to help resolve these issues, Washington decided to make a farewell address that states no permanent alliances or no political parties. Due to the constitutional issues that occurred, it created extreme conflict on limited federal power, and it played a highly significant role in establishing a federalist system based upon the idea of republicanism. And it also had to do with the separation of power, such as the judicial, the executive, and the legislature. In order for us to ratify the Constitution, we needed to get the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists to work together. And in order for that to happen, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists had to agree on the Bill of Rights, which is how it was adopted in 1791. Due to Alexander Hamilton's financial program and his creation of the National Bank, people began having disagreements and began conflict socially, economically, and politically. Due to people criticizing the government and having their own opinions, John Adams decided to sign the Alien and Sedition Act. The main purpose was to fight against criticisms that people were making against the government, but more specifically, the Federalists. Due to this unnecessary act, the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution was signed and drafted in 1798 and 1799. And this took the position that the Federal Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. The resolutions argued that the states had the right and the duty to declare unconstitutional acts of Congress that were not authorized by the Constitution. Not least is the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson had won the election as president, and it was significant because political power was shifted between parties peacefully.